Okay, I'm gonna get started. Thank you all for being here tonight. Tonight is the 17th of September 2020, and the law office of David P. Shapiro, San Diego criminal defense firm, is happy to have Justin Brooks here with us, the director of the California Innocence Project. Justin is the fourth presenter or the fourth group event that the firm has hosted during COVID. We've had group of our networking of attorneys. For one, when the pandemic started, when everyone was in lockdown, we had Juan Melendez, a death row exoneree that myself and Stefano and Justin know well. Juan spoke to a nationwide audience that we were able to secure his presence in June. We then were fortunate enough to be joined by Hall of Fame wide receiver Andre Reed and San Diego resident Andre Reed, who spoke about teamwork and overcoming the odds. He spoke late in July, and the star power of someone like Justin Brooks has blown the two of them away as far as the interest in this event and the number of people that have reached out to the firm to get the Zoom link, to who may be watching on Facebook Live, so on and so forth. So, today being Constitution Day, we figured what better way than to have Justin Brooks here. Our firm, we pride ourselves on helping good people regain control of their future when charged with a crime. So we do a lot of stuff on the front end, in court, pre-trial, and trial work. And our hope is that, God willing, none of our clients ever need a hero like Justin Brooks to come in and get them out of a place that they have no business being. But it is such a comfort to the criminal defense bar, particularly in San Diego and throughout the state of California, to know that if someone is wronged, if one of our clients is wronged, and especially if they are factually innocent, we have someone like Justin and his team at the California Innocence Project to back us up and do justice, and most importantly, take care of these people who do not belong to be incarcerated. So I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Stefano Malea, who's going to provide an introduction of our featured speaker tonight on Constitution Day, September 17th, 2020. The law office of David P. Shapiro is proud to present Justin Brooks. Stefano, take it away.
Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us. As you can tell, we're very excited to have Justin here. But I want to start off with a question. Have you ever been accused of doing something you didn't do, right? Something that I'm sure all of us have experienced to some extent at some point in our lives. Sometimes it hurts our feelings. Sometimes it hurts our reputations, or at work with friends possibly. Might even cause you to lose some friends or maybe even a job. But imagine being accused of a crime you didn't commit and then being convicted of that crime. And not just convicted, but then sent to prison while the world just keeps moving on without you. All the while you're completely innocent. Years or decades taken away from you, you can never get them back. 1 minute in prison, I think we can all agree, while you're innocent is wrong. But think about spending 5 years, 24 years, or 36 years. And these are all real number of years that innocent people spent in prison before our speaker and his team set them free. Justin Brooks is the director and co-founder of the California Innocence Project. Prior to coming to California, he practiced as a criminal defense attorney in Washington, D.C., Michigan, and Illinois. And over the course of his career, he has served as counsel on several high-profile criminal cases. He has been recognized several times by the Los Angeles Daily Journal as one of the top 100 lawyers in California. In 2010 and 2012, California Lawyer Magazine recognized him with the Lawyer of the Year Award. And on September 25th, Justin will receive the International Lawyer of the Year Award at the Warren M. Christopher Award virtual reception. Justin has also worked in founding and supporting innocence organizations in Latin America. And not surprisingly, he is the author of the only legal casebook devoted to the topic of wrongful convictions. And if that's not enough, how about the fact that he was portrayed by actor Greg Kinnear in the Brian Banks movie? Now, there's no denying that Justin and his team at California Innocence Project do incredible work. And hopefully you're wondering, how can you support them? It's not by sending Justin a gift card to Starbucks, because as I'm told, he hates coffee, and Starbucks in particular. But apparently that didn't stop him from using the Starbucks bathroom on his walk from San Diego to Sacramento to deliver clemency petitions to Governor Brown. So look out for the link in the comment section to learn more about CIP and how you can help their important work. And if you can, please donate. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Justin Brooks.
Thank you so much. I've never had my hatred of Starbucks mentioned in an introduction, but thank you for pointing out that I was the person who drafted the city council proposition to ban Starbucks from Ocean Beach. But that's a story for another day. And
Wow.
they basically went against everything they promised us along the way. But anyway, I'll set that aside. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate being invited here tonight by my colleagues in the criminal defense community. And I'm going to talk tonight about causes of wrongful conviction. You know, when I started in this work 30 years ago, you had to convince people that there were innocent people in prison. But now, after all the years we've been doing this, and after all the people we've seen walk out of prison, it's now about why, and studying why, and trying to decrease the number of wrongful convictions. So the California Innocence Project that I co-founded 20 years ago, I started it after I had worked on a death penalty case in Illinois of a young woman who was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And not only was she sentenced to death on a plea bargain, but she was factually innocent. And it shocked me that in the United States of America, an innocent person could be sentenced to death without a trial. And I worked on that case with law students. And I also saw, working on the case, the benefit of the training you could do with law students by having them work on real cases. So the idea of the California Innocence Project was to, first of all, get innocent people out of prison, realizing that there's a lot of them. The second thing is, though, that it's a law school clinic. And so it's devoted to educating lawyers along the way. And I'm proud of the 30-some people that we've walked out of prison, but I'm also very proud of the hundreds of students we've trained in the project who've gone on to be great lawyers. And our third mission was to seek legal reforms, to assist with training and changing the justice system, doing some more front-end stuff so cases, as was said, don't end up in our office that don't need to be. And so for 20 years, we've been doing that. We've gotten innocent people out of prison, we've trained a lot of students, and we've written laws that are now the law in the state of California. We were part of getting compensation laws passed for people who are wrongfully convicted. We were part of changing the law, the new evidence standards, part of DNA access laws. And so we've spent a lot of time on that as well, a lot of policy work. When I started the project, there was only a handful of people doing this work in the United States. There was a project in New York, one in Chicago, one in Arizona, one in Washington State. And now we have more than 60 innocence organizations across the United States. And I sit on a board that oversees all of them. And there's also projects all around the world. We have projects throughout Europe. We have projects throughout Asia. We have projects in New Zealand and Australia. And out of our office in San Diego, we coordinate projects all throughout Latin America. We've got multiple projects in Mexico, and then we've got them all the way down to Chile and Buenos Aires. Why do we have so many projects, and why has there been explosive growth in this field over the last couple of decades? Well, it's simple, because there are innocent people in prison everywhere. There are law students that need this kind of training everywhere, and there's reform work that needs to happen everywhere. And that's why we've really seen an innocence movement. And between our projects, we've freed hundreds of people from prison. This is a picture of Tim Atkins walking out of prison, one of my clients, after 23 years for a murder that he didn't commit in Venice. I love this picture for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't believe Tim believed he was getting out until this exact second. He was a big, tough guy. And he, after 23 years, it was, I think, just too hard for him to comprehend that it was over. And until he saw his sister there coming towards him, he really broke down at that moment. I also love it because the woman in the red jacket was one of my law students. And she was key to the exoneration. She tracked down the key witness in the case that the LAPD and the LADA's office couldn't find that was needed to reverse the conviction. So it really represents in one photo, you know, what we're really about. We receive a lot of mail. California is the state with the most people in prison in the country with the most people in prison. So we receive, you know, 1,500 to sometimes it's a lot more than that every year, requests for assistance. And every single one of those cases is looked at. And that's a system that's taken years to develop and would be impossible without law students. Law students are a miracle. They put in thousands of hours of work and they do it for free as part of their training. And we also have hundreds of volunteer lawyers who work with us who help us screening cases, help us in investigating cases, and sometimes litigating them. We get cases from, you know, usually directly from inmates and their family members, sometimes from defense attorneys and appellate attorneys that think a case, you know, needs another look. But we also often get cases from law enforcement and directly from district attorneys' offices. And it's great that I've seen a lot more of that cooperation in the last few years than I was seeing when I started the project 20 years ago. So how do we work these cases? Well, the bulk of our project's work is investigation, right? It starts with thousands of letters. Those thousands of letters end up being files, and then students take those cases on and start investigating them. In the beginning of the school year, we take them out to the desert for a few days and we train them on basic criminal investigation. We train them on basic crime scene investigation, how to interview witnesses, how to look for evidence. And then we give them a stack of cases and they run with them. And they're supervised very closely, but they're the ones putting in huge amounts of hours. The students go out and talk to the original trial and appellate attorneys. They read through all the briefs and the transcripts. They go out to the crime scenes. They interview the witnesses. They visit the clients in prison. They track down any physical evidence if it exists. And then we have this sort of awful process where we have to narrow down what are the cases that we have a chance of winning. And the sad reality is there's a lot of people in prison who are innocent and there's no chance of winning their cases because we have the burden of proof, unlike at trial where the prosecution has the burden of proof. In my world, where we're kind of the last stop, we have the burden of proving innocence. And so twice a week, we have students presenting their cases in front of the class and the other lawyers in my office. And I typically have the awful Caesar-like thumbs up, thumbs down power of whether cases go forward. And typically, you know, they'll go forward as long as we can keep looking for evidence, but we close a lot of cases and whittle it down to the ones we can win. So yeah, in a typical year, we might get 1,500 letters coming in. That might turn into 150 investigations where we've got possibilities. That could turn into 10 to 15 habeas filings. And if it's a good year, we'd walk 2 or 3 people out of prison. So it becomes a sort of 1,500 down to 2 or 3. It's tough, that part of the work, very tough. But if we have the evidence and we can prove it, we put on a hearing in front of a judge. A habeas hearing is basically a bench trial where you go through all the machinations of a trial, but in front of a judge. And if everything goes well, we have an exoneration. Here's a photo from one of our exonerations, Kenneth Marsh, who's a San Diegan who spent 20 years in prison. And the woman with the red hair was his girlfriend, who for 20 years said that this baby fell off a couch. But due to the doctors missing that the baby had an undiagnosed blood disorder, they didn't figure out that that's why the baby had so many bruises, and in fact wasn't a case of abuse. Fortunately, we presented this case to Bonnie Dumanis when she was the county district attorney, and she agreed, and we walked him out of prison. And that's how the cases should get resolved. It should be by cooperation, but lots of time it's not. When I came to California 20 years ago, I really didn't realize there were kind of 2 Californias. And the further we go out into the desert, it seems, the tougher the litigation is. A lot of times we get less cooperation in the desert counties, but in San Diego, we've been very successful. Why do we need these organizations? Well, as I said before, there's been a lot of exonerations. And in fact, there's now been, and this number needs to be updated, there's been more than 2,000 documented cases of wrongful conviction in the United States. And there's a thing called the Registry of Exonerations, which is a very serious academic database run out of UC Irvine and University of Michigan. And they look at the cases across the country and have documented more than 2,000 of those cases. This statistic, I always get the question, how many innocent people are in prison? And it's not knowable, right? But this statistic is very chilling to me. And that is that 4% of people who've been sentenced to death in the United States were ultimately walked off death row after a finding of innocence. Now, 4% is an extraordinarily high number when you look at the fact of how many people we have in prison, when we're getting into the millions of people in prison. But the thing that's even more chilling about this is criminal defense lawyers and prosecutors know that death penalty cases get the most scrutiny, the most media, the most resources. They have bifurcated trials. They have automatic appeal to the state Supreme Court. So these are the cases that get the most due process, and yet in these cases, we still see this kind of high number of wrongful convictions. So how many wrongful convictions are there in simple drug cases, simple assault cases, cases that really don't get anywhere near the level of scrutiny? There has to be a significantly higher amount. So we know it's the tip of the iceberg. And also we know this, after all this time, and all these people we've walked out of prison, we now have enough of a group of people to study, why they went to prison. And, each one of these wrongful convictions is a plane crash. And we study plane crashes to make sure we can fix the system and not have the next plane crash. And it's the same thing we need to do with wrongful convictions. And we have been doing it, but we can do more. And what we learned when we looked at the first 300 DNA exonerations was that the leading cause of wrongful conviction was misidentification. And I think that surprised a lot of people, that 58% of those cases involved a bad ID. And I'm going to talk a lot about that tonight because I think it's not intuitive as to why it's happened. And there's a simple answer. And the simple answer is when someone walks into court and says, I'm 100% sure that's the person who committed the crime, that person's likely getting convicted, even if there's not other strong evidence. But we now know after studying the science of identifications, that it's actually not very strong evidence. So there's a real disconnect there. This, by the way, this photo is the lineup from the case I mentioned earlier, Marilyn Malero, which is my client who was sentenced to death in Chicago. And I love this photo because when you look at it, I always ask groups like, who in this photo do you think didn't commit a double homicide and isn't concerned about facing the death penalty? And if you all look at it now, you can come up to your own conclusions, but almost everyone always picks the woman in the black and white top because she's smiling. And the reason she's smiling is because she worked at the police department and they needed to do a lineup with Puerto Rican women. And so she was having a good time standing in a lineup, thinking it was kind of a fun thing to do. Same thing with the woman in the Bulls jacket. She was dropping off lunch to her sister who worked there. And then they had her stand in. And the woman in the purple jacket, same thing. So you have all these people kind of having a good time participating in a lineup. And then you have my client who's in the black dress with the red pockets. She's scared to death. She's got the classic 500-pound hands like a first-year law student on call. And she's projecting fear. And then you have the actual murderers in the middle. Jackie Montanez, who's just got that kind of I don't care look on her face. There's so much nonverbal communication going on in these live lineups that it's very confusing as to being distracted from really looking for the person who committed the crime. You add on a whole lot of things that happen during these processes that make them suggestive, which I'll talk about in a bit. And we end up with this huge number of people who are misidentified. The second reason we found is informant testimony. And California's got a big problem with this. California has some of the heaviest sentences in the country: 3 strikes, mandatory minimums, death penalty, and people want to get out of those charges or get them reduced. So sometimes the informants have real information and sometimes they just make it up. But we now know after the study that 31% of wrongful convictions can be linked to false information from informants. We also know that there's going to be always a certain percentage of misconduct in the criminal justice system by police, lawyers, judges. 17% of those cases were linked to some form of misconduct. And this was probably the most surprising to people, which is that 17% of innocent people confess. And we now know definitively that innocent people confess. Now, a lot of people think they would never confess to a murder, but most of those people have never been through an interrogation. What this study showed was that after 12, 13, 14 hours of interrogation, people just get tired, they get angry. Sometimes they're not signing the confession while they're crying. They're signing it because they're angry and they're saying, well, just give me this paper, I'll sign it. What do I care? I didn't do it. I just want to get out of here. And then, maybe the police drum up a bad ID. Maybe they get a false informant. But we do know definitively that innocent people confess. And that's why the idea of dismissing confession cases as that person must be guilty is just not accurate. And we've seen over the years a lot of problems with defense counsel. This drawing is from a famous case in Texas where a lawyer was sleeping through the trial. And the Texas Court of Appeals said you have a right to a lawyer, but not necessarily one that's awake. This is a problem. And we don't find so much in our work that lawyers don't have good training, that they don't know what they're doing in court. It's more the problem lies with investigations and the lack of resources put into investigations, where lawyers are missing things or not, properly investigating a case. So let me talk a little bit more about ID issues, because I think it's interesting and it's also the leading cause. This, by the way, is my favorite lineup. This is actually from a wrongful conviction. And whenever I have a group in front of me, I always say, who is the suspect in this case? Look at the photo for a second and think who you think the suspect is. Now, people often say 18, the guy on the far right, because he just looks suspicious. People sometimes say, oh, the guy standing behind the line there, hiding next to 21. Really overthinking it. But the obvious suspect in this case is 12, because everyone in this photo is a police officer except for number 12. And number 12 is being held in the lineup by 3 police officers. So imagine the witness looks at this lineup, everybody else is smiling and having a good time, and one guy's trying to fight his way out of the lineup. Now this would be funny and like an episode of Cops, except for the fact that this led to a guy going to prison for several years for a crime he didn't commit. This is definitely not a good idea in terms of how to act in a lineup. You really want to disappear. So let's talk about why these IDs go wrong. And it starts with understanding how memory works, because an ID procedure is basically you have a memory of someone, and now we have to extract that memory in order for you to use it to make the identification. And memory doesn't work like a video camera. You're not recording all day long and then able to play it back. Memory works more like a computer in the sense you take in all the information all day long when you're awake through sight, touch, smell, taste, and hearing. And you attach memories to those senses, and they're placed in all different parts of your brain. And then when you're trying to remember something, you're reconstructing that information and pulling it together. Sight, by the way, is not our best sense for memory. Our strongest memory sense is actually smell. I always tell students they can use smell to study. If they have something really smelly, like a smelly marker. They could put it in front of their nose when the professor is talking about something really complex and boring, like the rule against perpetuities. And when it comes to the final exam, if they put that marker in front of their nose, they can help trigger the memory of what they learned that day. I don't know how many of them take me up on that, but it can work. So how does then that work? Well, we have 3 stages of memory, right? The first stage is the encoding phase. The second is storage. The third is retrieval. Now, in a criminal case, what that means is the first stage of memory is the information you took in at the time of the crime from the crime scene. The storage phase is what happened to you between the crime and the ultimate procedure with the police for the ID. And the ID procedure is the retrieval phase, where you're trying to take that memory and make the ID. If I'm cross-examining a memory eyewitness, I will have cross-examination questions on each one of these phases, because I need to know where was the possibility of contamination of this memory? Where might this memory have gone off the rails? So I need to know, who did they talk to at the crime scene? Other witnesses, the police, what was said? What could they have adopted in their own memories that wasn't really a memory? What were they exposed to after the crime scene, and ultimately when they had the procedure with the police? Did they see the news? Did they read the newspapers? Did they talk to other people about the crime? And then ultimately, it's important to know how the procedure went down with the police, and was it suggestive? Each one of these phases is important. Each one of these phases, someone can have their memory changed. And if you don't believe that, all of you think right now, a time in your life when you told a story and you told it 3 or 4 or 5 times, and you changed the facts of the story. Maybe you changed them so that you'd look better in the story, some other reason, but everybody has done this if we're honest with ourselves. If you tell a story 3, 4, 5 times and you change facts in it, eventually you can't remember the truth. So you can literally change your own memories. With children, it's extremely easy to change memories and create memories. If you have a 4 or 5-year-old and they want to go to Disneyland, you can actually just tell the child, I already took you to Disneyland. And when they protest and say that you didn't, you say, remember last year I bought you that red dress at Disneyland? And you bought a red dress, but not at Disneyland. Now the child's confused because the red dress part's true, but the Disneyland part's not true. Now you hit them with another one while they're confused. You say, remember I got you that cherry Coke at Disneyland? And you bought the cherry Coke at a movie theater. By the time you do 3 or 4 conflations like that of fact and fiction, the child will have created a memory of Disneyland. It's cheaper. You don't have to wait on any lines. You can just create the memory. Memory works like that. My children have no idea what's true from their childhood. They grew up in the Matrix. So memory is manipulated because you can change it, and also when it's incomplete, your brain can fill in the details, and sometimes those details can be contaminated. There's also obvious questions you ask of a witness that can affect the memory as they brought it in. How long they observed something impacts how much memory they have of it. Illumination, fear, alcohol, drugs. There's all those obvious ones that can affect your memory, but there's less obvious things. For example, a witness cannot assess the quality of a memory. I love when a witness says, I'm 100% sure that's the person, because the best follow-up question is, give me a memory you're 80% sure of, and they won't have an answer. Give me a memory you're 60% sure of. You either have the memory or don't have the memory. And the studies have shown that confidence in a memory doesn't have a connection to accuracy. So it doesn't matter if you're really, really, really sure as to how really accurate that memory is. Focus is the most important thing to memory, because without focus, we have no memory. So it's important to explore with a witness exactly what they were focusing on at the time of the crime. And if there's a weapon involved, they're almost always focused on the weapon, because the weapon is important. That can change their life. The face of the suspect is not that important. And so you see cases where witnesses who know nothing about guns have these crazy, amazing descriptions of guns and no description of the perpetrator's face. And that's because of the way memory works. Stress distorts memory. I hear students say they perform really well under stress. They focus really well under stress. It's not accurate. Your brain does not function as well in a stressful situation as a non-stressful situation. That's why in my teaching, I try to have my students not all freaked out. That's why people who are stressed about multiple choice exams don't perform as well on them as people who are comfortable with those processes. Stress distorts memory. And obviously that's important in a criminal case because there's a lot of stress. And this is perhaps the most interesting, cross-racial identifications. All of the studies show that people have trouble identifying people not of their own race. Lawyers seem very hesitant to talk about this in front of juries. People don't really like talking about race. It makes them uncomfortable. But we have to have this conversation because it's nothing to do with racism. It's just to do with science, and it's to do with exposure. Because your facial recognition software is developed in the first 4 or 5 years of your life. And if mom is white and dad is white and your brother is white and your sister's white and everyone you're exposed to is white, you're only going to be good at identifying white people for the rest of your life. And it's all about that. Yet this issue is not discussed enough. And we see time and time again these absolutely terrible cross-racial identifications that almost look random in how bad they ultimately are. As I said, without focus, there is no memory. And so you have to think about where is the focus and how is the memory adjusted. And part of that, and part of your focus is your expectation. We see what we expect to see. As we say in Spanish, vemos lo que esperamos ver. We see what we expect to see, and that impacts us. So if I tell you that this is an elderly woman, and that's what your expectation looking at this photo is, you're more likely to see that than a young woman. If I tell you this is the back of an Eskimo standing up, you're more likely to see that than a Native American head. If I say this is a musician, you're more likely to see that than a woman's face. Now, you could have been bringing all kinds of things to this experience, but expectation plays a part. Now, if all of you say out loud, Paris in the spring, Paris in the spring, Paris in the spring, 3 times, Paris in the spring. I can't see your faces to find out, but most of you probably see Paris in the spring on the board right now. And it is not Paris in the spring. It says Paris in the spring. But your expectation distorts what you see. This is why I tell people don't edit your own work, because you have an expectation that it's correct and you can't see the mistakes. And this is the reason why expectation plays a role in it. My favorite thing with expectation that I'm sure everyone has experienced is you're listening to a song and you've either listened to an album with that song on it 1,000,000 times before, or you have a playlist, but you're listening to the song out of context on the radio. You actually hear the next song start from your playlist or from the album you've heard before, and then all of a sudden it's a different song and it surprises you. That's how memory works. It's created an expectation. You actually hear the next song start in your head. And that is an important factor because there's a lot of expectations built into identification procedures. For instance, if the police say, we've got someone in custody and we want you to take a look at this lineup. Well, now your expectation is the person is there. They're in that lineup and you're going to pick somebody. Expectation absolutely distorts how we see the world, and your brain is easily confused. If you look at this for a minute, your brain will be confused by it because we don't see with our eyes, we see with our brain. And you'll start seeing black and white dots appear that aren't there. You'll start seeing circles start appearing from this. and squares popping out as your brain is trying to figure out what's going on here. You'll see this thing as moving, even though it's not. Your brain will think it's moving because it's confusing the way it's configured. You'll see this one moving, even though it's not. And this one is my favorite. If you take your hand and cover the screen with the woman on the left and just look at the right and the middle, both women will be moving in the same direction. Now take your hand and cover the woman on the right, and now the left and the middle will move in the same direction. Now take your hand away and just start looking to the left and middle and right and middle. And with your brain, you can actually change the direction the woman in the middle is going. Let's do it for a second till it starts freaking you out. You can actually use your brain like a witch. And why? Well, because when you look at the woman on the right, it suggests to you a certain thing and it contaminates the way you look at the woman in the middle. And when you look at the left, it suggests something to you and contaminates the one in the middle. So we don't see exactly what's in front of us. We see with our brains, and our brains are easily confused. When you look at this picture, those cars, probably one of them looks a lot bigger than the other, and it's not. It's to do with perception here of how they've set up the other objects in the photo, and it confuses your brain. And of course, there is the famous, what color is this dress, which there's been multiple studies and articles written about. And there's a great description of it on Wikipedia if you have any time. But I see here what's obviously a black and blue dress. But some of you are seeing a white and yellow dress. And a small portion of you are seeing a brown and white dress. Why? Not because half the world is colorblind, but there's something about this dress that makes suggestions to our different brains and the lines that these colors are on that makes us come up with different conclusions as to the color. And we're all looking at the same thing, but we're not seeing the same thing. And that's the critical point when it comes to ID procedures. If you read this quickly, films are flicks that are produced after years of personal effort and of unique knowledge, frankly, out of hard work. Take 10 seconds to count the F's in these two sentences. Films are flicks that are produced after years of personal effort and of unique knowledge, frankly, out of hard work. Count the F's. I'll give you 10 seconds. Now, I bet some of you found 6 F's. Some of you found 7 F's. Some of you found 8 F's. Some of you found 9 F's. And the reason is, if you've been reading English for most of your life, and you've been reading it for many, many years, words start to disappear. So some of you couldn't even see the word of when I asked you to look for the F. And it's because you don't need the word of to read these sentences. And even when I ask you to look for the F's, you can't see them. They actually disappear. Another thing impacting this is the relative opinion process, where the witness will choose who most looks like the criminal, not necessarily who is the criminal. And in this study they did a crime in front of 200 people. And all the witnesses were told that the true criminal may not be in the lineup. Yet only 21% didn't pick. The other 79% picked. 3% number 1, 3% number 2, 54% number 3, 13% number 4, 3% number 5, and 3% number 6. After they did their selection, the guy running the study said, it's not number 3, pick again, telling them again, you can pick no choice. So you'd think they'd all go to no choice, but that's not what happened. Only 11% switched to no choice, and all the rest went to number 4. Now, why is this an important study? Because if number 3 committed a crime and they weren't in that photo array, number 4 is going to prison for a crime he didn't commit. That's how important it is, this relative opinion process. And that's why we fought against the use of 6-pack photo arrays for decades and finally got reform passed in California last year that's banning them. someone always looks more like the suspect, and when you're making a relative analysis of it, you're going to pick that person. Much better procedure that's now being used in California and around the country and the world is showing one photo at a time, having them be random, giving time between photos, and viewing all the photos, not just a little 6-pack of them. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem in these procedures is when they're not double blind, meaning neither the officer, investigator, or anybody who knows who the suspect is, nor the witness should know who the suspect is when they're doing the procedure, because the police are not great poker players and they always give tells. And sometimes when they don't give tells, they always say something dumb at the end, like they'll do the ID procedure, everything's fine. The witness will say, looks a lot like number 3. And the officer will say, oh, good job, we got him. And now it goes from looks a lot like number 3 to when they're in court saying, I'm 100% sure it's that guy. And that kind of stuff completely throws off the validity of these procedures. And here's an example from San Diego of how this goes wrong. So Uriah Courtney was a client of the California Innocence Project. He got convicted of a sexual assault of a 16-year-old girl in La Mesa. She's walking down the street. She gets jumped. She gets pulled off the road. She gets sexually assaulted. After the attack, she flags down the police, and she gives a description, and they ask her to make a drawing, and she actually draws this drawing of the suspect. She also said someone was staring at her from a truck with a trailer in the back bed, and about 15 minutes before, didn't know if it was connected, but then the police went look in the neighborhood, found a truck. It was a relative of Uriah Courtney at his house, and then they do this photo array to make the identification. Now, what is wrong with this photo array based on this drawing given by this young girl? Well, the only thing you can tell from this drawing is it's a guy with a goatee. I mean, I'm sure he had ears, but there's just like no other description elements on this. And then when they do the photo array, number 1, no facial hair. Number 2, no facial hair. Number 3, a little Scooby-Doo thing. Number 4, full goatee, exactly like the drawing. Number 5, no facial hair. Number 6, little Fu Manchu. So who does she pick? Obviously, she picks our client. He looks most like the description because the description only has one element in it, and that's a guy with a goatee. We petitioned the court, and because it wasn't a rape, there was no semen, there was no rape kit, but it was a sexual assault, and the attacker was on top of her. So we petitioned the court to do DNA testing on her clothing. We find male pattern DNA all over her clothes that don't match our client. But that's not really compelling evidence because, you know, we all have DNA of other people on our clothes from just picking it up from chairs and things like that. But we have a DNA data bank that we can access. And on the day we ran the profile in the data bank, there was more than 10,500,000 offender profiles. And we get a direct hit with this guy. And if you look at him and you look at our client, and interestingly enough, in his mug photo, he doesn't have a goatee, which is another ridiculous thing about facial hair being used as a factor when it can come and go. You know, she didn't do a terrible job. They're both white males in their late 20s, similar hairstyles, similar sized foreheads, dark eyebrows, but it wasn't him. And that's how these IDs just go off the rails when they're not done the way they should be done. And here's the day he got out of prison with his parents after 7 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. There's a lot of other reasons too for wrongful convictions. I have a whole course on them at the law school as I go into all the details of different junk sciences that we've learned over the years, ballistics problems, bite mark cases, hair analysis, arson science, shaken baby syndrome. We've learned a lot in the last couple of decades about some sciences that we thought were a lot better than we now know they are, and all the different problems with them in terms of the diagnosis. And a lot of those have also led to wrongful convictions. Now, on the good news side, some of our successes, people we've got out of prison over the years. Jason Puracal was a client we got out of prison in Nicaragua. As I said, we do a lot of Latin American work out of our office, and he was a young guy in the Peace Corps who got falsely charged with drug trafficking with no evidence by some corrupt police officials, and spent 2 years in prison down there before we got him out. Matt and Grace Hong was a couple we represented in the Middle East. They were an American couple over there working on an engineering project for the World Cup games. And they woke up one day and their daughter had died. And they had 3 kids they'd adopted from Africa. The responding officers saw an Asian couple and Black children, assumed they were slave traders, took them into custody and charged them with murder. The entire case was fabricated. You can do a Google search of this and see how shocking it was that they spent time in prison there till we finally brought them home. Jason Kindle was the first person we exonerated. The California Innocence Project, 4 years in prison, bad ID case. And he was actually ID'd based on his voice. It was the robbery of an Office Depot, and one of the employees said the robber sounded like Jason, and the robber was wearing a mask. We were able to establish by using a photo of the front door and the robber entering that Jason was actually 6 inches shorter than him. And we got him released in front of Judge Ito, actually not long after the O.J. Simpson trial. And for those of you too young to remember that, Judge Ito was the judge on the O.J. Simpson trial. Brian Banks is probably my most famous client. Not probably, he is. Brian's case is so simple in some ways, but such an important story that Hollywood decided to make a movie out of it. And as was mentioned, Greg Kinnear plays me in the movie, great actor. A 15-year-old classmate accused him of rape, and nobody investigated it. And he ends up going to prison on a plea bargain because he thought that was his best option when he was staring down 44 years to life in prison. And later on, she came forward and said that it never happened. Brian was one of the best football players in the country when he went to prison. When he got out, he was 11 years older. He'd never even played his senior year of high school football, and he'd had a full scholarship to USC that he lost. But he ended up playing a short period of time in the NFL, and that's why Hollywood made a movie about it, which is available now on Hulu if you want to check it out. Call Brian Banks. Kim Long, 7 years in prison. This is the moment she's exonerated. 2 of my staff attorneys there, Alyssa Biercall and Raquel Cohen, who were students in the project and then went on to be lawyers, are enjoying that moment of her exoneration after 7 years. Rafael Madrigal, bad ID case, 9 years in prison. Here he is with his mom on the day of his release. Adam Riojas, 13 years in prison, another bad ID case, and here he is after his release. Danny Larson, 16 years in prison, one of these horrible LA Rampart type cases where some corrupt police officers set him up because they just didn't like him. Reggie Cole, bad ID case, 17 years in prison. Here he is with his family on the day he's released. And Luis Vargas, 17 years in prison. Not one woman, not 2 women, but 3 separate women identified him as the man who raped them. He was held accountable for 3 rapes, and all those rapes were linked together, and they were linked to 32 other rapes in LA, many that happened when Luis was actually in prison, that all had the same MO. And ultimately we were able to link those crime scenes together with DNA and prove that it was impossible for him to commit them. And this is Luis at the moment of his exoneration. Guy Miles, 17 years in prison, bad ID. There's a great video on YouTube if you want to watch it about Guy Miles on the night we brought him home to his parents. They didn't know he was coming home, and it was incredibly emotional. Jason Rivera, another bad ID, 19 years in prison. John Stoll, one of the Bakersfield corruption cases, 20 years in prison. There's also a movie about that case called Witch Hunt. Ken Marsh, I mentioned earlier, San Diegan, 20 years in prison, bad science. Horace Roberts, one of our recent exonerations out of Riverside, We not only exonerated Horace, but we proved that 3 other people who are now on trial for murder were the ones who committed the murder. This is Mike Semanchik, one of my attorneys, who was responsible for that exoneration, walking Horace out of prison. Suzanne Johnson, another bad science case, another San Diegan, 21 years in prison. We actually just got her out during this COVID crisis. So we haven't been able to get together and celebrate with her yet, but here she is with her family. Tim Atkins, I mentioned earlier, 23 years in prison, bad ID, false testimony. Bill Richards, one of those desert county cases. We battled for 15 years against the San Bernardino District Attorney's Office and ultimately proved him innocent. Alan Jimenez, San Diego case, 24 years in prison, misdiagnosed shaken baby case. Glenn Boyd, 27.5 years in prison, another bad ID case. Here's Glenn enjoying his banana pancakes after we got him out of prison. And that's the favorite thing of everyone in my office, is going to that first meal when we get our clients out of prison, because after years of prison food, it's a miracle for them. Quentin Morris, also 27 years in prison, bad ID case. Here's the day that he got out. And Marilyn Malero, who I mentioned in the beginning. And what I mentioned in the beginning was that we litigated her case and got her off death row. But what I didn't mention is, even though I got her off death row, I couldn't get her plea withdrawn. And I litigated this case along with lots of lawyers over the years. And finally, she got out of prison just in March. I started this case when I was 29 years old. When she walked out a few months ago, I was 55. It's really humbling, this work. And sometimes, you know, how long it takes. I tell my students, if you want a life like this is not the life for you, this work. If you want to know what's going to happen between 9 and 5, and then you want to go home to your family and have dinner and watch TV and have the next day be the same. If you want a life like this with lots of ups and downs, this is the life for you, because we have these incredible highs of walking people out of prison, but we have incredible lows, as I had for 25 years litigating this case and losing it time and time and time again in state court, in federal court, with clemency petitions. I lost a petition to the US Supreme Court. I lost a petition to the United Nations. A lot of failures ultimately added up to a victory, but it was a long journey. Rolling Adams, 28 years, another bad ID case. And Mike Hanline, number 1, 36 years in prison for a murder he did not commit in Ventura County. And this is the moment he walks out of prison, looking up at the sky. I love this photo. And then the woman standing next to him is his wife, who waited 36 years for him to come home. It's really extraordinary. There's an amazing video on YouTube about this release. It's called Man Eats Hamburger After 36 Years. And we have millions of views on it. And I encourage you to take a look at it. So, you know, that's the work that I do. I'd love you to go to CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org and check us out. And if you can support us, we'd love your support. If you want to see my rantings every day on these issues and other criminal justice issues, I'm on Twitter at Justin O. Brooks, Justino Brooks, also on Instagram and on Facebook. And I'm happy now to answer any questions anybody has.
Justin, we have a couple of questions in the chat. I have a question though first, as it relates to, I know you went through, you know, in your time, starting in your 20s and now in your mid 50s, right? And Stefano and I could probably rattle off a couple of names of cases that we are so proud of what we were able to accomplish, whether at the trial court level, in negotiating a plea bargain, getting a case dismissed. And at the same time, there's cases that we've gone to trial on, 1 or 2 in particular, that the client was convicted and we still think about frequently. So out of all of those people in that slideshow, what is the one that you look back on with the most fondness of the work? And what, if any, of the one maybe that's not on that slideshow that you really wish that there's something else that could have been done despite exhausting every remedy?
Well, the first one is easy. You know, I love all my clients. the 30 some people we've been able to walk out of prison every one of those days has been extraordinary and amazing. And most of them have gone on to lead great lives and they're close friends. And, you know, obviously Brian Banks' story became an international news story and became a big part of my life. But the Marilyn Malero case has really defined my career. I wouldn't be doing this work if it wasn't for her. I wouldn't have started the project. It's hard. When I got the call that she was getting out, I couldn't speak. I almost couldn't think after it was over of who I really even was if I wasn't representing her. It was that much wrapped up in my personality and who I am that I was out there fighting to get her out. And it's still, I haven't seen her yet. I talk to her all the time and text with her, but because of COVID, I haven't been able to get on a plane and fly to Chicago and celebrate with her. So it's almost not real for me yet. The losses. You know, that's a tougher question because there's just been so many. You know, people just hear about the big victories, and you know that as a lawyer, there's lots of times there's stuff you know, but you just can't prove it or put it in the context that the court needs to hear it, and you know the truth isn't getting out, and it's really, really frustrating. I'll give an example. This client we have, Patrick McNeil. We had this key witness who said that Patrick didn't commit the murder, that his brother did, and that his brother had confessed to him this. And this was his brother's best friend. We bring this guy in court to testify, and he's a long distance trucker. And the judge, as typically happens, says, I don't have time today for this. Let's do it next week. Guy says, hey, I only have this week. You know, I drive across the United States. And the judge says, you are ordered to return here. So this is just a guy who was trying to help out. Next week, of course, he doesn't show. I talk him into coming back, set a new hearing date, walks in the room. The judge says, didn't I order you to be back here? And he said, yeah, I had a job I had to do. Take him into custody. Put him in handcuffs, shackled him, locked him up in the jail for the night to teach him a lesson. Of course, he comes in the next day. He's not going to help us at all at this point. He's angry. He doesn't have anything to say. And he just walks out of the courtroom, and we lose. And that's it. And the truth doesn't happen. You know, the judge's ego caused this whole system just to go off the rail over nothing. And that's what's so frustrating. I know I'm preaching to the choir with you guys. It's just, you know something's really true and you can't prove it. Right. Within the context of our system. And it's really frustrating. Or intentions are put on your witness that you know aren't true, but the judge buys it. So we're very careful, much more careful now than we were 20 years ago, to make sure we're getting the most credible case together possible, because we just go in thinking people are going to put bad intentions on this and try to beat it up no matter what it is. Right. So yeah, there's lots of losses. There's lots of scars.
Stefano, you want to go through some of them in the chat? I know we see a couple of questions coming through.
Yes. So let me ask one here. Someone asked, Chris Eggers asked, what is the most efficient way you identify clients that can most benefit from your expertise? I think you talked a little bit about the tons and tons of mail that you get. But how does somebody kind of approach California Innocence Project? Is there a system in place?
Yeah, there is a system. I wish it was less like Ford assembly line theory, but it's the only way that we can process so much stuff. So we have a questionnaire on our website that families download and we send out to inmates. It has all the details in the case we're interested in looking at. We use a lot. It was funny, when I first moved to California and started really reading appellate briefs, I thought, oh my God, there's no advocacy in the facts in these cases. These lawyers are terrible writers. And then I found out that California had a rule that you had to write the facts in a neutral way consistent with the conviction. That's not true in other states. There's a lot of advocacy in the facts and sometimes facts left out. So the appellant opening brief is the quickest, most efficient way to see in 20 pages whether this is a possible case, because you can get a real sense of what it's all about. And some cases you just know on their face are nearly impossible. I mean, most drug cases, because there's only two elements. Did you have drugs, and did you know you had drugs? And if the jury thought you knew, and they found you with drugs, those cases become pretty much impossible. A lot of self-defense cases become pretty much impossible. So we have a whole screening process that involves all those things I talked about, that we investigate every single case, but some of them get closed early on because we just know this kind of case never goes anywhere. Other things that pique our interest are cases that are linked based on identifications, because we know there's problems with that. Linked solely on a confession, we know there's problems with that. Linked to certain police departments or certain police officers that we're aware of involved in misconduct, that piques our attention. Certain cities like Bakersfield, California, which leads the nation in wrongful convictions, those cases are always interesting to take a second look at. So, but we try to look at everything with at least some attention.
Do you ever get pulled into wanting to do trial work again?
100%. I mean, the good thing is these hearings are trial work because they're a bench trial, basically. But I love the jury side of trial work. Like, a lot of people don't love it. I love doing voir dire. California, they don't give you as much room to do it as other jurisdictions I've practiced in. But I mean, that's probably why I'm a law professor. I like getting up in front of the group and parsing through their brains. And that's kind of the same process law school is doing voir dire. So I might end my career back doing, I've got a friend out in Hawaii who's a public defender, and she had an opening on the Big Island to do cases of trial work. And she said, a lot of fishing violations, but you're in trial every day. Maybe I want to do some low stakes trial work at the end of all this.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about the clemency work that you guys have done? I know that the walk from San Diego to Sacramento, and then maybe tied into what can people do other than supporting California Innocence Project and the various organizations to, so people can do their part to help fix the system where it's gone wrong.
Well, people can also look up on YouTube. I did a TEDx talk about clemency and about the walk across California. So, when Jerry Brown came into office, I thought maybe we have some opportunities with Jerry Brown to get some clemencies. And so we wrote these petitions up for 12 of our clients that we thought were very, very deserving. But then I thought, California's the size of a country. Getting the governor's attention on a clemency petition is nearly impossible because everybody files them. So I came up with this stupid idea that I would walk the clemency petitions from my office in San Diego to Sacramento. I went to work the next day, kind of hoping people would talk me out of it. Instead, they said, "That's a great idea, boss. We should definitely do that." And then Mike Samanchik and Alyssa Biricol, two much younger lawyers in my office, decided to walk with me, and we walked from San Diego to Sacramento. At first, we thought it would be only like 500 miles. It ended up being 712, the only way we could do it legally and safely. It was an amazing experience. It took 50 days to do it. And, but we get there. I did get a meeting with the governor's staff that I hadn't been able to get for a long time. We present the cases. Immediately, there's a huge turnover in the staff, and the clemency petitions just sit there. Nothing happens with them. Eventually, we got the governor to reduce 2 of the sentences, making them parole eligible. So we won those. We continued to litigate the cases in court, and we've had much more success with Gavin Newsom in getting clemencies granted, particularly due to COVID. So now 10 of those 12 are free. And we continue to fight. It's very difficult, these clemency petitions, to get that kind of attention on them. But you got to be tenacious and not give up and find connections to the governor's office and make some noise, because it is opening up across the country. And this has been one of the big changes with COVID. Governors are looking for ways to let people out of prison. And as I always say, if you're going to let people out of prison, why not start with the innocent ones?
So, do you have any other that popped up for you?
Yeah, I see one that talks about how it's from Danny regarding, it looks like Danny wants to do some paralegal work. And I know that with the Innocence Project, a lot of the work is done at the lower levels by your law students. Mm-hmm. Is there a pathway to help for someone who may be in paralegal school?
Sure.
not be in law school, how can they get involved in the Innocence Project and work with you guys?
Yeah, we actually have every level of volunteer. In fact, some of my favorite volunteers come from High Tech High here in San Diego. Those kids are amazing, and they come in and do all kinds of stuff for us, create videos. They're great with scanning documents, and they actually go through files and help organize them. So we have high school students, college students, law students. We've had paralegals, and we have lawyers that all volunteer for us. You can go on our website. There's a volunteer section on it at CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org. Right now, we're struggling to train any new volunteers because we're completely online. So it probably would be in the new year that we'd be taking on some new people and do some new training, but definitely check it out.
Okay, I have a follow-up question to something you alluded to earlier when you were talking about the first meal, right? Stefano and I represented someone who was in for about 18 months, was completely, not guilty across the board from first-degree murder all the way down. And later that day, we get the verdict at whatever it was, like 1:45 or so last summer. And, 5:30, we're telling the family, oh, yeah, he's going to get out, 9, 10 o'clock. Call us if he's not out by midnight type of a thing. Then we get a call like, yeah, he's going to be released in about 20 minutes. So we rush down to the jail to George Bailey. I'm like, all right, let's take him to dinner. His family and our families came because they saw the work, that we put in the case. Man, we all had a great meal. And he was just amazed with the freshness of vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
That was 18 months. And that was county jail. That's not 18 years. That's not 30 years. That's not California Department of Corrections food. Yeah. What has been the most unique request or the most unique meal that you've been a part of for someone who's been exonerated and released?
Oh, it's definitely Mike Hanline. And that's why I encourage people to watch the video. Man eats hamburger after 36 years. Mike Samanchik, the lawyer in my office who walked me across California, took this video. And when Mike got out, we always say the same thing. We'll take you anywhere you want to go. You name the restaurant, doesn't matter. So Mike says, I've been seeing these Carl's Jr. ads for years, and that looks awesome. So I said, we can definitely take you to Carl's Jr. So we take them there and video the whole thing, and it looks like a Carl's Jr. ad. I mean, he takes a bite out of the burger, and he says, oh, so that's what meat tastes like after 36 years in prison. So we put it up online, and it went viral and hit like 7 million views pretty quickly on YouTube. So Mike actually reaches out to Carl's Jr. and says, hey, how about the hookup from Mike Hanline? We basically just did a commercial for you with millions of views. So they tweeted out a card that said, Mike Hanline, free food for a year from Carl's Jr., which he loved. It wasn't great for his health, but he had that for a year. So that was definitely the most unusual experience of it. But every one of them is awesome. I can't encourage people enough to participate in one of those events if they can, because yeah, it's kind of like, imagine if you watch the show Survivor and you see how those people eat after they've been on this island like 30 days. And then you imagine like your client and our clients of how long they've gone without fresh food or anything good. It's extraordinary.
For sure. For sure.
And one question,
go ahead.
Yeah, one follow-up question on that. So, I suspect that after some of these freed individuals have spent so many years in prison, adjusting to life again must be extremely difficult. I mean, the psychological aspect of that has got to be, incredible. Are there any organizations or anything that people can do or support in addition to California Innocence Project to help those freed individuals get back into society, or are there any resources out there for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And most people never think about it. What I say to my clients before they're getting out is kind of, well, nobody cared about your case for 20 years. For the next 24 hours, everybody's going to care about it. And then they're all going to go away. And you need to prepare yourself for that, of getting back into normal life. So there's this immediate jubilation, excitement. And then it's, oh my God, I don't have a driver's license. I don't have a social security number. I don't have, I don't know how to use a computer. Department of Corrections, they don't get to use computers in California. They don't know how to get on the internet. They don't have a lot of those basic job skills that you need now, or communication skills. They've never used a smartphone. Some of it's great. like Mike Canline again, he calls me the night he gets out and he says, have you ever slept on a Posturepedic mattress? It's like sleeping on a cloud. And everything in his life is brand new and fresh and amazing after 36 years in prison. But the next thing you know, he's calling Social Security and they're saying, why didn't you register when you were 65? And he's saying, because I was in prison. And the whole world has gone on. He was an auto mechanic before he went to prison. And then he comes out and said, these are computers. I don't know how to work on these cars. Actually, for me, one of the best examples of, and I show this to my students, of the problem is from the movie Austin Powers. Because when you see that movie, there's a scene where he's watching all the things that happened while he was frozen and has this really sad look on his face. And you really do get a feel of that, like people who lose decades of their lives in prison, how much change has occurred. So we work a lot with it. We have volunteer therapists who work with our clients. There are some organizations out there that help exonerees when they get out. We've had some very generous donors. There's a guy named Bob Wilson here in San Diego who's an amazingly generous guy who actually gives $10,000 to each one of our clients when they get out of prison to help them get their lives back on track. It's tough. We also worked to get the law changed in California because 20 years ago, you could only get $10,000 in compensation from the state after being wrongfully convicted. And we helped get a law passed that now you get $150 a day for every day you were wrongfully incarcerated. We've changed that law now 3 times. Because we had to litigate so many of those cases. And now it's a lot better process. But it's a serious issue and it's a difficult one for the system to deal with, because we kind of come in and pull people out of the system and they don't know what to do with them. I mean, for a long time, they wouldn't even get the gate money. We had to get a law passed so that our clients got the same services as parolees. They don't have a halfway house to go to. And I know a lot of people don't want to go to a halfway house, but some of our clients need housing. They don't get help with getting work. They weren't getting gate money, like I said. And then we got a law passed that says you're at least entitled to what a parolee gets when you're an innocent person who gets released from prison, but they're not on parole. So we're kind of a pain in the butt to the system, and we're proud of that, as I'm sure you guys are.
And that's a good segue to, an organization like Second Chance in San Diego does so much work with people getting out of custody.
Mm-hmm.
They've been in custody for 2 years or 20 years. And basic job readiness training, basic computer skills. The firm here has been very much involved. I've spent a lot of time over there before and actually during COVID, at least remotely, helping out with that. And that's a fantastic program, but not every county, not every, jurisdiction within the state has a program like Second Chance in their backyard like we do here in San Diego.
Right. And it's so easy to get so bitter, as you can imagine, very quickly if, things aren't getting back on track the way you hoped they were. The other hard thing is that very few of these guys have a chance at a civil suit. But some of them do, right? It depends on, who did them wrong, whether they have immunity, whether the filing deadlines have passed, all the many things we know as lawyers that distinguish 2 people who the same thing happened to them. They went to prison for something they didn't do. And what's really sad for me is every year we have a conference where we bring together all the lawyers doing this work and all the exonerees, and you sit in the room and some of these guys are in $1,000 suits and they're driving sports cars, and a lot of these guys are just completely indigent. And even as a lawyer, it's hard for me to comprehend why they're in those different situations when the same thing happened to them. But that's the cruelty of the justice system.
For sure. Stefano, do you have anything else in the chat, or we want to?
No, I think we're good.
Well, Justin, I'm gonna leave it to Stefano to close out. But again, it was great seeing you in this environment. Hopefully, when this is all over, we'll have a coffee at somewhere other than Starbucks.
Excellent.
And we appreciate it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure joining you tonight, and keep up the good work.
For sure.
Thanks so much, Justin. Appreciate it, and thanks for everybody joining us. And we're actually going to be recording this video and eventually posting it on our site. So send us a message if you want to be able to review it at another time. And again, thanks so much, Justin, and hope everybody has a great night.
You
All right,
too.
guys. Be
Take
safe.
care.
Healthy. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.